you're introducing innovation at the bottom of the system. And for a lot of these things, we just don't really know what kinds of effects they may have on the system. And it's particularly a problem if the system is already vulnerable. That remember function may not work in relation to that particular genetic modification. An analogous kind of thing happens quite naturally with things like mutation of bacteria and viruses. A new strain of virus can be lethal. Now, the people who make these genetically modified organisms will tell you that they test them thoroughly and that they're safe. I know nothing about biotech or bioengineering, but I think people are legitimately concerned about the potential for those things to bring about unexpected change and undesirable change. And that's the other thing to remember about these things. Because systems change, because they interact in unpredictable ways, surprises happen. Sometimes they can be happy surprises, things that you didn't expect to happen, do and they turn out to be good, but they can be nasty.
Could I just give you an example of that? I live in southern Quebec, just south of Montreal. I lived in the same house in the middle of a cornfield for 25 years. And when I moved there, milkweed, you know what milkweed is? It's a type of plant and uses latex, actually, the natural form of it anyway, was quite abundant and had become resistant to the standard chemicals of the 60s and 70s in the atmosphere. So it proliferated everywhere and was considered by the farmers a nuisance. Milkweed also happens to be the main form of feed for the monarch butterfly. It comes up from Mexico and migrates, feeds on the milkweed, and goes back down. Since the introduction of genetically modified corn, in particular, the herbicides have changed and the milkweed has almost been wiped out. So the consequence of that has been that, this is just observational, but over 25 years of seeing it year after year in the same fields, there's virtually no milkweed left in the land around our house. So that obviously has an impact on the because it's the only feed that they will, it's the only food that they will feed on when they're in the urban areas. So map that in the inside.
Yeah.
I have a question about kind of the distinction between, can you go back to, go forwards to one of those?
Go forward?
Yeah.
That way? That cool.
Yeah, keep going. So say this one here, and the difference between, so you gave an example about in some systems you have kind of like too much connectedness, and you gave an example it would be like a bureaucratic government or something.
Yeah, a rigid system.
A rigid system. But
so
would you say that on the right that kind of compares to a rigid system? Or is that a poverty trap? And
this is a system that's headed towards a poverty trap.
Okay.
If that degradation continues, you get soil erosion, so loss of nutrients, you get further soil erosion because there's no grass cover. So you get into a positive feedback which just drives that system into the ground. And you need to step in and take some kind of remedial measure, a restoration effort to stop all that and bring it back.
So there's a definite distinction between something being a poverty trap and something being too much. Because in a way, could you say that that's, there is maybe too much connectedness or it is too rigid because it can't get itself out of, or not?
This system is a system that's collapsed because it used to look like this, all right? Over here, it's looked like that. It's lost a lot of the components that it had there. And it hasn't been able to reorganize itself to come back to this. So this would be a system that's stuck in a poverty trap.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And the reason it's done that is because human users of this system have run too much livestock on it. And they've been going for maximum sustainable yield. And they've pushed the system over the top. But that's not the same as rigidity.
I have just a question about time scales and resilience. Do you have some more insight about how long you actually should collect data sets over a period of time? Because if you don't look long enough in a certain system, you may think it's trying to get to a different state, while still actually trying to bounce back to its original state. And I just wonder how time actually influences our perception where a system is.
Yeah, no, time is very important. And one of the initial parts of a resilience assessment is to cast back as far as we can in time to try and figure out what kinds of disturbances and changes have occurred in the system. Because all systems exist in their current state because of their history. The better you understand the history, the better you understand why you are where you are now. And the more able you are to think about, do I want to stay here or do I want to do something different?
Just not really a question, because probably no one can answer it, but it's maybe a scary thought. Was talking about thresholds, and I was thinking about the acidification of the ocean. And, there's going to be a threshold there at some stage if we go beyond, which is going to have some pretty big implications for the whole world. Is anyone doing any resilience work or studies, modelling on that you're aware of?
There is actually, and I haven't met him, but I've spoken to him. He's doing a lot of work in the Pacific on the response of corals to acidity and to bleaching. And obviously corals have experienced this kind of thing in the past, and there are places, as long as they're protected and they've got the full suite of fish on them, they actually come back. So although it looks as though they've been wiped out, in fact they haven't. There are enough, a small percentage, that have the genetic flexibility to cope with increased acidity or increased ocean temperature, and they come back. So nature is very resilient, and as long as we do whatever we can to enhance and maintain that resilience, it'll do wonderful things. It's when we try and oversimplify it to increase the yield of goods and services for ourselves that we get into trouble.
Any other questions?
I'm just interested in asking about redundancy. So basically, for instance, in ecological systems, if we think about guilds of species which have similar ecological functions, are those sort of excess species which are actually already represented by the ecological function of other ones, comparatively useless in terms of adaptation to change and such? Or if we even think about it on a social side, if we have groups of people with similar training and background and thoughts and ideas, are those excess people also not valuable? So this, from a biological diversity point of view, we seem to say that the greater biodiversity is positive and desirable. But if in fact there's a lot of redundancy in ecological function, is it not valuable from a resilience perspective?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and the answer is yes, it's highly valuable. That's why human cultural diversity is so important to us, particularly at this stage in our history. It's also why it's important to maintain the full range of species wherever we can, because it gives you what they call response diversity. So if you think about the potential on that, axis on the figure of 8, response diversity is all about the potential of the system to change.
But if the ecological function is already represented by 30 or 50 other species, some would say, well, it doesn't matter if this particular one goes extinct because there's still something else that's doing corals, there's still something.
But we don't actually know, although there may be 50 species in a guild that look as though they're all doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
They probably aren't. We just don't know enough to be able to distinguish the niche of the one from the niche of the other. And also, we don't know anything about what goes on in their genetic composition and what kinds of adaptability they have built within them. I'll just show you something. This is something a mathematician showed me the other day at a workshop, where they're trying to model the history of Europe to change, to help them figure out what we might sort of do in the future to deal with climate change. These are two different bell-shaped curves. This is a very narrow variability. This is a very wide variability. So we're talking about response diversity. High response diversity looks like this. Narrow response diversity looks like this. If your system shifts, like this arrow suggests, from this situation to this situation, if your response diversity is very narrow, you may not be able to respond to the change. If your response diversity is broad, this part of the population will be able to change. And he actually used that in the context of human ideology, our beliefs about the way we behave, the way we relate to each other, we relate to the environment. One of the biggest challenges we're going to have as we deal with climate change is the need to review and refine and change our ideologies, our beliefs. They are going to be challenged. And there's evidence of that from historical change. There's the story of the Norse who settled Greenland during a period of relative warming. Greenland was inhabited for about 400 years. And they were very successful until the cold came back. In order to survive, they needed to adopt the practices of the Inuit. They did that up to the point where they were required to surrender their attachment to their churches and their houses. So as the Inuit were able to move up and down as the seals and the fish moved, the Norse people couldn't do it. And they were extirpated. There was a ship visited in the early 1500s, they found one survivor. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, and that was associated with a lot of rigidity in the system, a lot of vulnerability, and the decline of agricultural production. What they found was that those bits of the Western Empire that were able to change very quickly from their beliefs in empire and the old gods and the old ways of doing things, they were wiped out. The ones who adapted and adopted some of the Christian values, in fact, and learned how to integrate with local people, they survived. And there's a lot of historical and archaeological evidence to support that. And this particular group that I was working with are developing models based on that archaeological and ecological evidence to help us think about the kinds of change we need to make in Europe as we deal with climate change. So this response diversity is hugely, hugely important.
Any other questions? Yes.
Okay, I just would like to know if you define resilience of a system based on its natural state, or also consider a human initiated or influenced system which is not intentionally to destroy the system but to maintain it. So I don't know, from your beginning point, when you say you want to, the capacity of a system in terms of its resilience, where is your beginning point? From its natural state, or a system that has been tampered with but with the intention to keep it going, to maintain it? Is that already a disturbed system?
That's a good question, and it's a question that bothers the conservation community considerably. Based on a lot of the old conservation philosophy, people were seen as something here, and the system or nature was seen as something over there. And a lot of conservation effort was aimed at maintaining this in its natural state and keeping these people out of it and stopping them from interfering with it. And also holding this natural system in some kind of stable state that represented its condition somewhere around the late 1800s. And it was based on a false assumption that the systems that we have in the world had not been affected by people. The people have been around for several million years. The minute they invented fire, they were able to have a major impact on systems. So anywhere where people were around the world using fire, what started to happen was the co-evolution of people and nature. And as we've gone from hunter-gatherers to pastoralists to farmers, so our ability to change nature has increased. There isn't a part of the planet that is natural, if you think of nature as being something separate from human. Which is why when we talk about resilience in social ecological systems, we're talking about systems of humans and nature. Because if you try and keep the two things separate, you're not getting a big part of the picture. If you think of humans as something separate to be treated differently from nature, then you're just completely dismissing all the environmental and ecosystem services that they're dependent on, and vice versa. If you treat nature as something completely separate, you're forgetting about the entire human history of interaction with the planet, with the ecosystems that make up the planet.
Any other questions? Section.
Okay. What I'm going to do now is just take you quickly through the assessment framework, which is drawn from the Resilience Alliance workbook for practitioners, which is published on the web. If we look up Resilience Alliance, sorry. There's just recently been published a book by Brian Walker called Resilience Practice. I have a copy in my hotel room. Sorry? You've got it? It's a 30-minute drive in a fast taxi, so. But anyway, if you get hold of a copy of that and read it, it'll give you a lot more depth on the kinds of things that I've been talking about in very much an applied context. So it's got lots of case studies in it that illustrate the application models and this assessment process that I'm going to go through quickly now. So basically it's very participatory and includes scientists from a range of disciplines and the local people to get that depth of knowledge that you require. And it gives you a preliminary model of how the system works that you test. These are the steps in the process. Participatory, iterative and reflexive. And it's iterative because as you start to develop this, so your understanding increases, so you need to go back and look at some of the things that you've developed before. And then it produces this management strategy, which as we've said, you implement with proper active adaptive management and proper passive adaptive management. So this is what the initial assessment yields. This is the same thing as that panicky model, but I've just taken away what some of my friends call the spaghetti and rewritten it in terms of subsystems, focal systems, system environment, the tendency for change to come from below, and the tendency for stability to come from above. And then this is exactly the same thing, looking at it from the bottom up. So the subsystems, the system, and the larger system within it is embedded. And then there's a disturbance event. So graphically, that focal description will give you a description of the system in those terms. This is a little diagram that shows you the history of management in the Florida, going back over over a period starting in the 1890s. And what it shows you is how these major disturbance events, floods, hurricanes and so on, how some of them have led to changes in management regime. So here was a flood event that led to a major change in the way management was done. Here was a drought impact that led to another one. Here was another flood that led to yet a new kind of